1986, Nintendo released Pro Wrestling for the Nintendo NES. Actually, in '86 it was released on the Famicom Disk System, and the NES version was released in 1987. Let's pop it in the old NES and see how it holds up today. In pro wrestling, you have the choice of choosing between 6 different wrestlers, and they are Fighter Hayabusa, Starman, Kincorn Karn, Giant Panther, the Amazon, and King Slender. I, of course, went with Starman because he's that f***ing cool. Any pro wrestler to wear all pink is basically challenging you to make fun of him. So anyhow, as I said earlier, in pro wrestling you have the choice of 6 different characters, and each of them have their own distinct moves. Actually, they only have 1 or 2 distinct moves, but still, they are distinct. For example, Starman's 2 special moves are the somersault kick and the flying cross chop. And you can see me do an example of the somersault kick right here. So yeah, every wrestler has 2 special moves except for Fighter Hayabusa. He only has 1, and his is the back brain kick, and the other is King Slender, and his only special move is the backbreaker. And you know what I love? Any game that congratulates you after you do well. Really boosts your self-esteem. Anyhow, the concept of pro wrestling is simple enough. It's a successive series of wrestling matches. They take place in 2 different circuits. The first circuit you play through is the VWA, which stands for Video Wrestling Association. Now, once you battle your way through the 5 contestants, and they culminate in King Slender as the champion of the VWA, unless you play, of course, as King Slender, then the champion of the VWA is Giant Panther. So after you battle through those and win the belt for the VWA, you move on to the VWF, which stands for Video Wrestling Federation. And in the VWF you fight the same 5 characters, but you fight them twice. Twice each for 10 matches. And if you manage to battle your way through all 10 matches of the VWF, you fight one last battle against Great Puma, who is the ultimate end boss champion title holder of the VWF. And if you manage to defeat Great Puma, then congratulations, you've completed the game. And you get a nice little end screen congratulating you. Now I'd like to talk briefly about gameplay for a minute. In pro wrestling, you're using the Nintendo NES gamepad or some equivalent compatible controller. And with that you have an A and B button plus a D-pad. And the A and B buttons have different functions depending on where you're standing and how you're positioned with your opponent in the game. They're multifunctional. For example, if you're standing next to your opponent, your A and B buttons kick and punch. But if your arms are locked together, they do special moves in combination with the D-pad. Or if your opponent's on the ground and you're standing next to him, your A button will attempt to pin the character, and the B button will pull him up by his hair. Pro Wrestling was the first wrestling game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it's a very interesting game. It was developed in-house by Nintendo's R&D Team Number 3, which is actually pretty curious in and of itself, because R&D 3 was mostly responsible for researching and developing hardware. They did very little with software. They did a few series of software games, most notably Punch-Out! But in general, R&D 3 was responsible for hardware, while R&D 1 and 2 teams were responsible primarily for software. Now, as you can see, the graphics are pretty good for an early NES game, and that's a high-quality mark that Nintendo always took pride in. There's a great deal of detail that they could have easily omitted, but they kept in there to improve the look of the game. Like, for example, the cameraman at the bottom of the screen that tracks you and your opponent. That cameraman serves no function other than aesthetics, but it looks great. And the actual referee that follows you around and comes over when you go to pin your opponent, or your opponent pins you, and actually does the count, is a nice touch also. They could have easily programmed that without an actual character and just did a count on the screen. But they included the referee, and I believe it's the first wrestling game for a video game system or computer that included a referee. And another nice touch is in the background you can see the crowd is not static. They actually are slightly animated, and there's a little variation in the crowd. And that was uncommon for early games, quite frankly. A lot of the games that had crowds in the background, they were all some kind of generic, standard character that was just static, didn't do anything usually. Pro Wrestling is generally regarded as the best wrestling game for the NES or Famicom. And I'll have to generally agree with that. It far outmatches any other wrestling game I've played for the system, and I've played quite a few. The details are nice, the moves are solid, the gameplay is solid also. And I believe this is partly possible because the budget for Pro Wrestling didn't have to go towards licensing of an official wrestling circuit or character or anything like that. All the money was strictly put into the R&D of the programming of the game, instead of licensing. And the end product is a very fun, very playable game for the NES. It was great back in 1987, and it's still good today. Pro Wrestling was a very popular game when it came out in 1987 for the NES, and subsequently, there are a lot of copies floating around of this game. You can pick it up very cheaply. It goes for about $2, and it's a $2 very well spent. Unfortunately, Pro Wrestling isn't available for the Wii Virtual Console, so the only way to play this game is on an actual NES or with a Famicom disk system. Unless, of course, you emulate games, but I'm not a big fan of emulation, and I try to discourage it whenever I can. The game should be played on their original hardware for the best experience. So if you have a chance to pick up a copy of Pro Wrestling for the NES or the Famicom disk system, definitely do it. It's a fun game, regardless of whether you like wrestling or not. It's an overall good time. I'm Dommy from Classic Games Revisited. Until next time.